Welcome to Politica, where we explain Israeli politics at a diaspora volume. And with Israel's critical election coming up in about 10 weeks, there's really a lot to talk about. We've talked before about the divisions that used to define Israeli elections, left and right, which generally meant that you were either for or against peace with the Palestinians. Peace is not a word that's on the table anymore, but that doesn't mean it's not there, somewhere in the back of voters' minds, even though the politicians avoid it completely. Shimon Peres had a line about this. He said there are two things in life that you can only achieve if you close your eyes a little: peace and love. Peres said that during the Oslo era, when closing one's eyes, squinting, believing in actual peace really felt possible. That's not where Israelis are now, and after October 7th, eyes are open and they're not closing anytime soon. And that's why peace isn't on anyone's platform in this election, not because Israelis don't want it, but because Peres's method for getting there requires trust that this electorate just doesn't have right now. Yuval, welcome.
Shalom, shalom.
According to surveys, most Israelis are exhausted and they want the fighting to stop. And for most Israelis, peace can simply mean the absence of war. It means sheket, quiet, a break between wars. But as we talked about last week, it feels like Israel is constantly on alert, almost ready for war at any moment. So Yuval, how are Israelis feeling right now?
Look, fatigue, I think, is probably the most dominant feeling. Fatigue with a mixture of confusion, with a mixture of maybe hope towards an election result, or maybe fear of an election result, because fatigue is now mixed into the politics of election. But fatigue from war is obviously a major theme. And this correlates with almost every aspect of our lives, because you cannot escape the burden of war. Every family in Israel has paid a price during these past 3 years. Some have paid the most awful price and have lost loved ones. Some have loved ones who have been injured, either physically or mentally. We're seeing an outbreak of PTSD. All of us have paid the price of living through this uncertainty and living through these waves of violence.
Let's talk about some of these costs of war, because any new government is really going to have to deal with that. It's one thing to put life on hold because the war's ongoing, but there are costs and those costs have to be dealt with. So clearly there's been a loss of economic output during this time, especially with ongoing reserve duty. That has also meant that small businesses have closed down. Sectors like construction and agriculture often suffer from labour shortages. There's a lot of workplace absence, especially with high-tech companies, which are really the engine of the Israeli economy. And of course, military expenditure, which has basically doubled in the last couple of years.
High enough as it is, right? Israel's military expenditure was amongst the highest in the world, and now it's even higher.
Many Israelis are on reserve duty and have had extended reserve duties. They're serving, I believe, minimum of 60 days a year, 2 months to 3 months of the year. People are being called up, and these are not just young soldiers in their mandatory service. These are reserve soldiers. People who are in their 20s and 30s, maybe even 40s, are still being called up for 2 or 3 months of the year on reserve duty.
Again, as I mentioned, this is really a reality for every family in Israel. Well, for most of the families in Israel, and that's a big hot topic when we discuss mandatory conscription with the Haredim. But every family in Israel has seen a family member or several have their lives completely changed due to reserve duty in the past 3 years. In our family, it's my sister. She's given hundreds of days since the beginning of this war. But in many families, if I think about, for instance, my kindergarten group, right? What happens when one spouse goes off for hundreds of days, right? Now suddenly the other spouse is raising toddlers, raising small children without another spouse at home. Think about the impact that has on their career. Think about the impact that has on how they can manage their lives. And then on a macro level, how that impacts the economy. My next door neighbor, he has a shop where he sells supplies for travel supplies, tents and boots and etc. And he was drafted, and he's been giving hundreds of days, up north, down south, right, really on every front. And his wife, who is a child psychologist, who's working on her doctorate right now, suddenly had to shift away from her studies, raise the 2 boys who have been in and out of school because of war, and take over his business so it doesn't fall and collapse. So that's the stress and the reality where small businesses are emptied of their employees because of reserve duty. Suddenly she has to shift away from her career. And think about, of course, the emotional impact and the emotional strain on this family for their relationship, for the children, for the two boys who suddenly don't have a dad at home, for the fact that during these rounds of violence where they have to go down to the bomb shelter, he's away and she's doing that by herself. So it ticks every single box just thinking about that one family.
I've seen a 2025 study, a government study, found 50% of reservist spouses report marital problems, and nearly a third have considered separation. So there's obviously a very big strain on marriages, not to mention the PTSD. There's a 40% rise in PTSD cases amongst soldiers. There is, and this is extremely difficult and sensitive topic, but double the number of soldiers that have committed suicide during this time. And more generally, the PTSD rates in Israeli society are up around nearly 20%. And just to compare that to what happens worldwide, the global baseline is usually around 4%. So mental health, marital strain, I mean, these are all things that Israelis carry and will carry into the election as the cost of war.
There was a figure that came out on that specific topic where the sewage water was tested. And in the testings of the sewage water, since the beginning of the war, there has been a spike in all sorts of trauma-related medication. Israel is now much more heavily medicated than it was before the war, and also drug use and drug abuse. People are self-prescribing.
And as you mentioned earlier, raising children, and particularly schools have been closed. They were closed for nearly 5 weeks of this Iran war. I mean, there's been on and off school closures. That means kids are at home with parents. Parents aren't able to go to work. Kids aren't learning. I mean, it's almost like COVID all over again. We've always talked about the fact that not everyone has access to a shelter, which is an added stress on top of everything else. So it's not surprising, given all of these stats, that there has been such a wave of immigration, of Israelis leaving the country. I mean, every time it seems like there's a new record of Israelis leaving. What's interesting about that is also the kinds of Israelis that are leaving, which tend to be those that are actually very beneficial to Israel's economy.
The data speaks for itself here. When you look at socioeconomical levels of the people leaving, so amongst the lower levels, right, Israelis with a lower income, lower education, etc., the numbers haven't really changed dramatically. The numbers have shifted extremely dramatically above the higher percentages, above the people who are making a lot of money, above the people who are educated. These are the Israelis who are leaving. Brain drain is definitely a concern, and the economy, of course, would be taking a hit. And we're speaking about roughly 200,000 Israelis. That's almost, Tel Aviv is only 450,000 residents. You have to understand how dramatic that number is. And that's a big election issue as well. Not only the people leaving, but will they come back to vote?
Problems that we've mentioned are not problems for the individuals who are suffering from those problems. These are social issues. These are social problems. And one of the things that I think is very obvious from all of those stats that we've kind of referred to and all of those problems is that those that are doing reserve duty, it's the soldiers and their families that are paying the biggest price. So let's talk about one of the hottest topics. And what this topic is basically a phrase used in Israel, which is who is under the stretcher. Let's talk about why that is a hot topic. What's the background to that?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the metaphor itself, right? The fact that the metaphor mitachat la'aluka, under the stretcher, comes from the world of military. It's obvious that a society dealing with war would use this kind of metaphor to explain who is participating in the burden and who isn't. And this goes, of course, for the very, very hot topic of Haredi mandatory conscription. But not only. Many parents, after March and April, when schools were shut for so long, demanded the Ministry of Education and demanded parents to give us back these days in July, right? Why do we have to have such a long summer vacation with our kids at home after we had basically a summer vacation because of Iran? And then what happened was the teacher unions said, we're not going to do that. And they were accused of not being mitachat la'aluka.
There is this idea that during wartime, Israelis are supposed to have a sense of camaraderie and everyone is supposed to play a part. Those who are in the military and those who are looking after the kids at home and the small businesses that, as it is, so hard to make a living, and here they have long periods where they're not open or don't have employees. And no matter whether you're Jewish or Muslim or atheist, everyone is affected by rockets. But still, the majority of the costs that we've mentioned are still being borne by some more than others. And this is a particularly hot topic because The IDF has been saying for a long time that it is short 12,000 regular soldiers and 9,000 combat troops. And it's supposed to get worse. That number's supposed to rise to about 17,000 by the end of the year. Let's start with the facts. Army service is compulsory by law for all Jews, Druze, and Circassians once they reach the age of 18. The Arabs legally are not obliged to do mandatory conscription, but they can volunteer. Most of the hotness of the topic is around the Haredi community. They are bound by the conscription law, but there's been an informal arrangement since 1949 when Ben Gurion made basically a deal to build up this religious camp back in Israel again after Jews were massacred in the Holocaust. And so there was this exemption. It was sort of an informal arrangement that has been ongoing since then. Every time successive government tried to codify this and create an actual legal exemption for Haredi young men, and the High Court has always struck it down and said this is inequality. We cannot have this. Is literally inequality before the law. It's a constitutional breach. When this exemption expired, the High Court in 2024 said, listen, there's no more law. There's no exemption in place. Technically, Haredi men are supposed to be drafted. Why aren't they being drafted?
So let's further contextualize this issue, because it's been a hot political topic, not just since October 7th, but much before, right? When we think about characters like Yair Lapid, who rose to the Israeli center about a decade and a half ago, that was his main ticket issue. Mandatory conscription for everyone to share the burden. Back then, I remember kind of the mainstream Israeli narrative was that view was kind of populist. People could live with the fact that Haredim aren't going to the military service for several reasons. One of them was not many people wanted Haredim in the army. The thought was that if we were to draft all the Haredim, the army would become more religious, less liberal, less pluralist, not a great place for women. The other big factor was the economy. It was much more important to integrate Haredim into the economy and into the workforce than it was into the military. And this correlates also with ideas that the military before October 7th was on a trajectory to becoming smaller. Mandatory conscription for men went from 3 years to 2 years and 8 months. With the high-tech nation and with AI and with technology, Israel can afford to have a smaller and smaller army that is more professional and that is better equipped, but we don't need these massive number of soldiers. All that completely flipped on October 7th. Both the narrative of how is it possible that only one side is suffering so much loss while tens of thousands of people have a blanket exemption, but also for the actual need, right? The IDF is no longer speaking like it did in 22 or in 2019. The IDF says we need soldiers. We need foot soldiers on the ground to protect our borders. It's a physical need. So that's why this debate now has exploded.
And from the Haredim side, really what they say is that they believe that their service to the country is through prayer and through religious observation. They believe that is actually a form of service and they don't need to have other service in addition to that. And then they also say that the army doesn't have the conditions that allow them to keep their practices, their religious practices. So even though the army is technically kosher and the bases keep Shabbat, by nature it's a mixed gender environment, and so that doesn't accord with the Haredi lifestyle. And I've seen quite a few people say, no one promises me when I join the army that I will come back alive. So why should the army promise Haredim that it will ensure that they will remain committed to the Torah? If their faith is strong enough, that should survive even during their army services. These attempts to create exemptions are actually very politically unpopular, even amongst the right. And this is where Netanyahu, it could actually legitimately lose voters to opposition right-wing parties like Bennett and Lieberman.
And not only opposition right-wing parties. In the past week, we saw 2 defectors from Likud say that they were going to be starting a new party with the main ticket agenda of canceling this exemption. Conscription for all has become really a main issue in this election. And we even see Netanyahu himself. He's now doing a big podcast campaign where he's going through the various podcasts that have many listeners in Israel, and he's interviewing for all of them. And he's also starting to be more hawkish on the issue, right, around the election. Yes, they will be drafted. Yes, we will find a way. So the semantics are just, are we going to find a way together with the Haredim, or are we going to find a way without them and kind of force them into it? But I think, obviously, it's a tricky issue. It's a very tricky issue that many governments, even before this government, have tried to solve and it's hard to solve. Because for the Haredim, going to the military really completely challenges their way of life and their way of thought. And for that to work, you would have to have entire units in the army that exist with completely different sets of rules. And what does that mean for the army? That we have suddenly these troops or these groups in the army that are run or semi-run by religion? What does that mean about, the Israeli democracy?
It's interesting that you say that Netanyahu's starting to talk it up, because since 2024, 80,000 conscription orders were issued to Haredi men. I understand only about 2,000 have actually been enlisted, and there's no enforcement around that. Just before the election was called, the government banned the arrest and prosecution of Haredi draft evaders, at least until after the election. So there really is an inequality there. Netanyahu, if he goes into this election talking a lot about war, he's really going to have to deal with this issue of the Haredi exemption. You can't keep saying we're going to keep fighting and there'll be more wars without being able to put the resources behind it. And you know that he can't do that with the Haredi parties as part of his coalition. So is it possible that he would pivot and try to find peace and sheket and not war as his election campaign, because that way he doesn't have to deal with the Haredi issue? What do you think about my wild speculation?
I think for generations, the Israeli center has hoped for Netanyahu to pivot towards peace. And almost always the numbers make sense. Almost always you'd say, well, if Netanyahu were to suddenly pivot towards peace, in a similar way, for instance, that Sharon did in 2005 when he,
not me.
Yeah, in a similar way when Ariel Sharon in 2005 went on this hard line, remove Israeli settlers from Gaza and start initiating this process. And he was, of course, from the Likud. And then he got the overwhelming support of the Israeli center, right? So the Israeli center has always kind of had arms open towards Netanyahu. If you only pivot for peace, we'll sit in your coalitions with you. And Netanyahu coalitions in the past have been formed over similar promises. Famous Dove, Tzipi Livni, formed a coalition with Netanyahu, I think it was 2009, under the promise of her being able to negotiate peace with the Palestinians. So this kind of thought and this notion that it would be politically beneficial for Netanyahu to run down the alley of peace has existed for a while now, but time and again, it hasn't actualized.
In the past, Netanyahu was always called Mr. Security. And I think that image has really been hurt, not only by the October the 7th, the fact that Hamas is still in power in Gaza, but really by the Iran war, which hasn't delivered the clear wins that he needed. I remember when it first happened and Khomeini was killed, people were already starting to talk about, okay, well, we'll have an election very soon because Netanyahu will on a ride off the back of this military success into elections. But really we had to wait until the very last day that elections could be called, because actually he's trying to create distance between himself and all of these military lukewarm, I won't say failure, lukewarm success, not really what was promised. And I think in the case of Iran, there's a sense, particularly amongst the public, certainly amongst the world, that Israel's a passenger now in this war. So that image of Mr. Security, I think, has definitely been harmed. I've seen that they've started to talk once again about Saudi normalisation, but I fail to see how Netanyahu could get any wins on relation to Saudi normalisation, because the pathway has always travelled through some form of statehood autonomy. And Netanyahu's coalition partners credit themselves in the fact that they have prevented time and again any formation of Palestinian autonomy, any formation of a Palestinian state.
To talk about the Mr. Security narrative, with Netanyahu's base, many of them still perceive him on that ticket, even with October 7th, even with the multiple fronts with Iran, even with what can be perceived by some as a failuring strategy. Netanyahu has been running for the past 3 years under the slogan Nitzachon Muchlat, a total victory. Now, what does a total victory mean in the eyes of his base? It means that Hamas is completely defeated, that Hezbollah is completely defeated, that Iran is completely defeated. Now, while reality doesn't point to that total defeat, his base still has the patience to endure the process. And they see things like, the beepers in Lebanon as a huge win. And they see just the fact that we were bold enough to go after Khamenei and to go after Iran and to engage with direct conflict with Iran as a bold move, as something that takes, cojones that only Netanyahu has. So he has been seen as this leader of the very hawkish style of military deterrence and military offensive that is very much associated with him. And if we talk about, the other big candidates, Eisenkot, which is now the one, spearheading the polls, seen as the main challenger for Netanyahu, a very interesting figure, former IDF chief of staff, lost his son, very unfortunately, in this war in Gaza, right? He's a big name. But his attackers from the right, the attackers specifically from the Netanyahu camp, accuse him of being more dovish, accuse him of wanting to end the war a year in and not when still there weren't the accomplishments that they claimed to have in front of Hamas and before the offensive on Lebanon and on Iran. So they accuse him of being less of this hawk and less of this Mr. Security than Netanyahu. And that's, of course, debatable.
But I think this forever war rhetoric from Netanyahu, it really conflicts with his alliance with the Haredi parties. If you're going to be in a forever war, how can you then go ahead and provide this exemption that the Haredi parties, we know that they will not form a coalition unless they are promised this exemption in any way, shape or form. Why they keep believing that Netanyahu can deliver this is actually a little bit beyond me, because in all of these years, there have been many attempts to try and deliver this official legal exemption to the army, and they've never been successful. So this idea that we need to keep being at war and we need to do more, as I said before, it needs the resources to back it up. And the Haredi coalition is preventing Israel from having those resources.
Sharon, this boils down to another famously attributed characteristic of Netanyahu, which is his political short sight. He always sees the next political gain. It's hard to look at the decade ahead, 2 decades ahead. And that's why, under 2 decades of Netanyahu's rule in Israel, we haven't seen a fix, not to this huge issue of the Haredi conscription problem. We haven't seen a fix, obviously, or any progress made on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Right? So many of these huge issues that have huge impact on all of our futures have kind of been managed in a let's buy time kind of perception by him.
People in the diplomatic world always used to say that Israel doesn't have foreign policy, only domestic policy, which means that local public opinion is really what drove Israel's interactions with the world. It definitely drove what, any concessions that Israel would be willing to make or not willing to make in relation to the Palestinians. And it makes a little bit of sense when you always need to have a coalition, to have a government. You are driven constantly by your other parties, by local opinion. Netanyahu made a speech not that long ago suggesting that Israel was Sparta, that it was able to kind of be alone in the world. But Israel is not Sparta, as Netanyahu claims. It has and always has and continues to rely on international partners, including ongoing security cooperation with the Palestinian Authority. International isolation is a real threat, and where it threatens the most is Israel's economy. And therefore its military. Israel's military budget has doubled in the last few years, but it's not just the budget, it's also the technology, the brain power, the innovation that comes out of the economy that really contributes to Israel's military edge over its neighbours. We also know that US military aid to Israel, which is about $33 billion a year. And again, I've said this before, it's not cash money being handed over. It's spent on US hardware, usually. That used to be a holy cow in US-Israel relations, but is now a centrepiece in the US midterm elections where politicians are already lining up to say, we will end this aid. So Israel is not Sparta, and consideration of any kind of forever war has to take all of that into account.
Well, Israel, although growth has stagnated a bit, continues to grow. And 2025 was actually a record year for Israel in terms of venture capital coming into the country. Big tech acquisitions, big energy export deals, specifically with Egypt. So the Israeli economy very much depends on the support of the West and of the support of Western democracies and Western economies. But at the same time, we all know that the West is also changing. And things like cyber defense and military security and R&D in those fields are becoming a major concern and a major priority for many of these nations, and including some of our partners in the Gulf and some of our partners in the region.
Despite nearly 3 years of war, as we've said, Hamas is still standing. It's not defeated militarily. Iran, the mullahs, the IRGC, they're still in power, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon. Deep down, Israelis want sheket. They're tired. And I suspect that many feel that they haven't won. And in fact, the surveys indicate that at least half of the population doesn't feel that there is an overwhelming success to all of these wars. So if you can't sell war to your population, to your voter base going in, are you going to try and sell something else? Quiet, peace, some other kind of life?
I think what's unfortunate is that this notion of perpetual war and of us forever living on our sword is no longer a notion only on the Israeli right. It has very, very much trickled to the Israeli center and to the Israeli moderate right and even to the Israeli left. And if we look at, the leader of Israel's left-wing party, Yair Golan, he's a military man, right? He's a more moderate, he's a left-wing military man, but he's a military man. And if we look at the moderate parties, Eisenkot, of course, a military man, lost his son. Naftali Bennett was a fighter in an Israeli elite unit and has a very military mind state. We mentioned resilience. I have a close acquaintance with the manager of a resilience center in one of the Gaza border communities. And a resilience center is basically another word for saying trauma care center. Now, why say resilience center and not trauma care? So you have to understand that's so much of the Israeli narrative is that we have chosen. We have a way to, we rise above to the challenge. But the underlying reality is, children wetting themselves at night and couples getting divorced and families, crushing under the economic burden and the stress of war. So that friend of mine who works at that center says she hates the word resilience. And she hates the fact that it's called a resilience center because it's basically gaslighting the public. Everyone wants quiet and everyone wants us to no longer have to fight our way to survive. But what are they willing to do to reach that quiet? Those are very different. That's where the population differs.
The Middle East, in every sense, shapes Israel. It's not Switzerland, as Israelis like to say. And so it leaves us with this question here in the diaspora. We've always made the case to Western audiences that Israel is a Western country in a hostile Middle East. It's a democracy in a region that doesn't have many, a country that fights because it has to, not because it wants to, and that these wars, some people even say, are civilizational. It's a defense of Western values themselves. This Israeli government, sometimes I think, looked around and said, okay, well, why can't we be more like our neighbours? And they've pivoted to be more Middle Eastern, putting religious faith over faith in democratic institutions, quashing dissent, flirting with authoritarianism. And there is a certain logic to that, because if you can't beat them, then join them. It is a very tough neighbourhood.
So my grandfather was a Jewish immigrant from Syria, from Aleppo, from Khalib. And he used to say to me, I went to peace camp as a teenager. And I met all these friends from the West Bank, from Gaza, from Jordan, from Egypt. And I came back home, very inspired for peace and for reconciliation, etc. And he used to say to me, Yuval, because I'm an Arab, because I speak Arabic, because I have lived amongst Arabs, because I know the Middle East, I know there will never be peace, and I know the Arabs will never make a reconciliation with us. Many of the Likud supporters are, in fact, the Mizrahi Jews who experienced a lot of marginalization and trauma in the founding years of Israel. They feed into that narrative of, because we are from the Middle East, because we are not Westerners, because we are not Europeans, we understand that in the Middle East, you must act like you are in the Middle East.
But being more Middle Eastern is not necessarily going to bring sheket. If you look at your neighbours, just look around and see their own prolonged wars with each other. So while I understand that sentiment, following in their footsteps is not necessarily the right path. Israel's military is financed by a Western economy. The arms are bought from Western country. Israel develops Western technology. Its miracle economy is not a oil economy, it's a tech miracle. And it needs global markets and highly educated talent. That same talent has been leaving. This brain drain is a real threat to Israel's economy and therefore its military power. So being able to be strong against your neighbours still relies on its Western part, not its Middle Eastern part, really, to have that deterrence against its neighbours. The rhetoric might be Middle Eastern, but the reality is definitely more Western. Israel can neither make war nor peace or even sheket without being a strong Western nation. Thank you for listening to Politica. Give us a like or subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. We're going to continue to talk down all the way to the Israeli election. And until next time, keep the volume down.